HOA built 2 mansions on my inherited land, so I made their entire board pay rent. How could something like this even happen? And what kind of situation could possibly lead to an entire HOA board paying rent instead? If stories like this keep you watching until the very end, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone built on land you inherited? It all began on a morning that looked ordinary enough, right up until one moment made me realize nothing about that day would ever be ordinary again. People think stealing land starts with a bulldozer. It doesn't. It starts with someone believing you'll never come back. The first thing I noticed wasn't the houses. It was the smell. Fresh concrete drifted through the cool Texas morning, mixing with sawdust and freshly cut Bermuda grass, the kind of scent developers love because it smells like profit. Then came the rhythmic clatter of pneumatic nail guns, the low growl of diesel generators, and the steady beep of a reversing forklift somewhere beyond the tree line. I slowed my pickup truck as the gravel road I had driven since I was 6 years old opened onto a sight my grandfather never would have believed. 2 massive stone-and-brick mansions stood proudly in the middle of my family's inherited land, their oversized windows reflecting the morning sun like trophies. Decorative fountains sprayed crystal arcs into the air, freshly planted maple trees lined a curved driveway, and expensive landscaping covered ground where wild bluebonnets used to bloom every spring. For a long second, I honestly wondered if I had taken a wrong turn. I reached for the old county survey folded inside my glove compartment and checked the parcel number again. Same road, same boundary lines, same 31 acres my grandfather had left to me before he passed away. My name is Ethan Walker, and every inch of this property carried memories money could never replace. I learned to fish in the creek running behind the north pasture. I learned to drive an old Ford tractor beside the weathered oak barn that no longer stood. My grandfather always said land was the only thing that remembered every promise people forgot. Standing there that morning, I finally understood what he meant. As I stepped out of my truck, crushed limestone crunched beneath my boots, and warm wind carried the scent of fresh mulch across the entrance where a polished stone monument proudly displayed the words Willow Creek Estates Luxury Collection. That sign had never existed. Neither had the wrought iron gates stretching across what had always been my private access road. Before I reached them, a uniformed security guard raised one hand and gave me the practice smile reserved for people considered inconvenient. "Residents only, sir." I pointed beyond the gate. "I own that land." His smile never moved. "You'll have to speak with the HOA office." I almost laughed. "HOA office? On my land?" Before I could answer, a white luxury SUV rolled smoothly toward the entrance. The driver's door opened, and a woman in an immaculate cream-colored suit stepped onto the pavement with the confidence of someone accustomed to having the final word. She carried a leather folder under one arm and dark sunglasses that reflected my own puzzled expression. "Good morning," she said politely enough. "I'm Victoria Ashcroft, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She glanced toward the houses behind her before looking directly into my eyes. "Sir, I'm afraid you're trespassing." Ethan Walker, 39 years old, commercial land surveyor. That description usually ended conversations before they became interesting, because most people think surveyors spend their days staring through tripods and arguing over fence lines. The truth is we spend our careers learning that the smallest mark on a map can be worth millions of dollars. My grandfather understood that long before I did. He bought these 31 acres in 1958, back when this part of central Texas was nothing more than cattle pastures, limestone hills, and dusty county roads. Every Saturday morning, he would wake me before sunrise, pour black coffee into his old metal thermos, and tell me to grab my boots. By the time the first rays of sunlight reached the tops of the oak trees, we would already be walking property lines, checking old corner markers, and talking about things that sounded painfully boring to a 10-year-old boy. Easements, boundary monuments, mineral rights, survey monuments made from iron pipe buried beneath the soil. I remember pretending to listen while chasing grasshoppers through waist-high fields, but somehow every lesson stayed with me. He always stopped beside the same weathered cedar post near the creek and rested one rough hand across the top. "Land tells the truth," he liked to say. "People change. Paperwork gets misplaced. But the land never lies." I did not appreciate those words until years later. After college, I built a career helping families settle complicated property disputes across Texas. Ironically, I spent decades protecting other people's land while rarely visiting my own. When my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I moved to Colorado to be closer to her assisted living facility. She needed someone familiar every day, and there was never any question about what I would do. My work became remote whenever possible, and every few months I flew back to Texas to pay taxes, inspect the property, and make sure everything remained exactly as my grandfather had left it. I trusted the county records. I trusted the fences. Most of all, I trusted that 31 acres of inherited ranch land would still be waiting for me whenever life slowed down enough to return for good. Apparently, someone else had developed a very different idea. As Victoria stood comfortably inside those elegant entrance gates, she looked at me with the calm confidence of a person who had repeated the same speech dozens of times. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. She genuinely believed she belonged there more than I did. Behind her, contractors continued installing decorative stone around one of the fountains. The sharp smell of fresh mortar drifted across the entrance while landscapers rolled out strips of emerald sod that looked almost too perfect to be real. Nobody stopped working. Nobody even looked in my direction. To every person on that construction site, I was simply another stranger standing outside a neighborhood that already considered itself finished. I slipped my folded county deed back into my jacket without saying another word. There was no point arguing beside a locked gate. Not yet. Something about Victoria's confidence bothered me more than her accusation. People bluff all the time. She was not bluffing. She believed every word she had just spoken, and that realization told me this situation was far bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Victoria tilted her head just enough to make the gesture feel rehearsed instead of polite. "If you believe there has been an error," she said, "our legal department will gladly explain everything." Her smile never reached her eyes. I thanked her, climbed back into my truck, and drove away without another word. In my experience, the loudest person in a property dispute is usually the one with the weakest paperwork. The confident ones are different. They speak softly because they think the documents already guarantee victory. That quiet confidence stayed with me all afternoon. Instead of checking into a hotel, I drove straight to the small county diner where my grandfather used to eat breakfast every Friday. The place still smelled like fresh coffee, buttered biscuits, and bacon sizzling on a cast-iron grill. Mrs. Evelyn, who had owned the diner for nearly 30 years, recognized me before I even sat down. "Ethan Walker," she said with a surprised smile. "I heard somebody finally came back for that old ranch." Those words stopped me cold. Finally came back. That meant people had been talking about my property long before I arrived. I asked her what she had heard, keeping my voice calm while stirring coffee I had no intention of drinking. She lowered her voice and glanced toward the front windows. "Everyone says the developer bought that land over a year ago. They held community meetings. They showed drawings. The homeowners association kept saying the paperwork was all legal. Bought the land. Not leased. Not managed. Bought. Someone had convinced the entire town that ownership had already changed." Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off brand-new pickup trucks parked along Main Street. Construction crews filled the diner, laughing about deadlines and open houses. One man proudly mentioned that the model homes would be finished before the fall parade because buyers were already lining up. Nobody questioned where the land had come from. Nobody had any reason to. People trust polished presentations more than dusty county records. Before leaving, Mrs. Evelyn reached beneath the counter and handed me an old folded newspaper clipping she had saved because my grandfather had once been featured in it after donating part of his pasture for a volunteer fire department training exercise. I smiled as I carefully slipped it into my jacket beside my deed. Another small reminder of the man who always believed paper mattered. Driving back toward the property, I noticed something I had missed that morning. Along the roadside stood colorful banners advertising luxury living, private walking trails, and exclusive community amenities. Every banner displayed the same elegant Willow Creek Estates logo. Every advertisement featured the two nearly completed mansions standing on my family's land. The developer had not built quietly. They had invested heavily in marketing, sales events, printed brochures, and public promises. That meant dozens of contracts, permits, invoices, engineering reports, financing agreements, and insurance policies already existed somewhere. Every brick they added created another document. Every document created another trail. And every trail eventually led back to one question that no amount of landscaping or expensive stonework could erase. Who actually owned the ground beneath those foundations? The next morning, I arrived at the county records office 15 minutes before the doors opened. The limestone courthouse looked exactly as it had when my grandfather first brought me there decades earlier. The old clock tower still chimed every hour, and the worn marble floors still echoed beneath every pair of boots that crossed them. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of aging paper, polished wood, and dust trapped inside filing cabinets that had witnessed generations of property transfers. This place had one advantage over every glossy sales office in town. It did not care who sounded more convincing. It only cared what had been officially recorded. I requested every document connected to my parcel number during the previous 5 years. The clerk recognized my last name almost immediately and gave me a curious look before disappearing into the archive room. 10 minutes later, she returned with a stack of deeds, plats, easement filings, tax assessments, and development permits thick enough to fill an entire banker box. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly organized. The subdivision maps were professionally drafted. Survey stamps looked authentic. County approval signatures appeared exactly where they should have been. If I had not spent nearly 20 years reviewing land records for a living, I probably would have accepted every page without asking another question. Instead, I slowed down and read every line. Experienced surveyors rarely begin by searching for obvious mistakes. We search for tiny inconsistencies, a date that arrives too early, a legal description copied from an older survey, a reference to a monument that no longer exists. Those details usually reveal far more than dramatic errors ever could. After nearly 2 hours, one page finally caught my attention. The subdivision plat referenced a boundary survey completed 18 months earlier by a private engineering firm. That alone was not unusual. What caught my eye was the legal description attached to the survey. It described neighboring parcels with remarkable precision, but referred to my family's acreage using language that seemed strangely incomplete. There was no reference to the original monument established in 1958. No mention of the creek serving as the western boundary. No citation of the historical survey my grandfather had carefully preserved. It was as though someone had copied only part of the property's legal identity while quietly ignoring the rest. I requested the engineering firm's survey file. The clerk apologized and explained that only the final certified copy had been submitted. The field notes were not included. That answer made me even more curious. Every reputable surveyor keeps detailed field notes because measurements always need supporting evidence. Without them, conclusions become much harder to verify. Before leaving, I paid for certified copies of every document related to the development and carefully organized them inside a leather portfolio. As I walked toward the courthouse parking lot, my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. The caller introduced himself as Carl Benson, the lead developer behind Willow Creek Estates. His voice was smooth, confident, and almost friendly. He said he had heard I was asking questions and believed we could clear everything up over lunch. Then he added one sentence that stayed with me long after the call ended. Sometimes old paperwork creates confusion that is easier to solve with a business conversation than a legal one. I thanked him for the invitation, but I already knew I would not be discussing history over sandwiches. If the paperwork truly supported their position, nobody would be trying so hard to keep the conversation away from the records. By sunset, I had spread every certified copy across the small dining table in my hotel room. The air conditioner hummed steadily in the background while the smell of stale coffee filled the room. Highlighters, sticky notes, and my grandfather's old brass ruler slowly covered the table until there was barely enough space left for my laptop. I had reviewed thousands of property files throughout my career, and one habit had never failed me. When a story looks too perfect on paper, stop reading from the beginning and start reading from the ending. I traced every recorded document backward, one filing at a time. Construction permits led to engineering approvals. Engineering approvals pointed to subdivision plats. The plats referenced deeds. The deeds referred to legal descriptions. Every step appeared complete. But something about the sequence felt unusually clean, almost as if every document had been prepared with the expectation that nobody would ever compare it to records older than a few years. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my younger sister, Emily. She asked how my trip was going, and after a long pause I finally told her what I had found. Silence filled the call before she sighed. "Ethan, maybe it is time to let it go." Her words surprised me more than anything else that day. She reminded me that the property had sat untouched for years, that developers had money, lawyers, and influence, and that fighting them could take years. She was not trying to discourage me. She was trying to protect me from spending the rest of my savings chasing something impossible. After we hung up, I stared through the hotel window at the lights of the town where I had grown up. For the first time since arriving, doubt quietly settled into my mind. What if everyone else was right? What if some document had been signed while I was caring for Mom in Colorado? What if my grandfather had sold something without telling anyone? The questions lingered longer than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I visited 2 local attorneys who specialized in real estate disputes. Both listened carefully. Both reviewed several of the certified documents. Both gave nearly identical advice. One estimated that a lawsuit involving a completed residential development could easily cost well into 6 figures before reaching trial. The other warned that even if I eventually proved ownership, years of appeals could follow. Neither attorney said I was wrong. Neither attorney said I was right. They simply described how expensive uncertainty could become. Walking back to my truck, I felt the weight of every folder under my arm. Across the street, a billboard advertised Willow Creek Estates with smiling families standing in front of the same 2 elegant homes. "Open house this weekend," it read in bright blue letters. They were already selling a future that depended entirely upon everyone believing the past had been settled. As I unlocked my truck, my eyes landed on the old wooden toolbox resting behind the driver's seat. I had packed it almost without thinking before leaving Colorado because it had belonged to my grandfather. Inside were rusted measuring tapes, faded notebooks, an antique compass, and a small iron key taped beneath the lid with yellowed masking tape. Seeing that forgotten key suddenly brought back a memory I had not thought about in years. My grandfather once smiled as he locked an old cedar chest inside the barn and told me, "Some papers are too important to leave where everybody expects to find them." In that instant, I realized there was one place I had not searched yet, and something deep inside me whispered that my grandfather had been expecting this day all along. The barn had disappeared years ago, but the old limestone foundation still marked the place where it once stood. Early the next morning, the rising sun cast long shadows across the pasture as I walked through dew-covered grass, carrying the small iron key from my grandfather's toolbox. The smell of damp earth and cedar filled the cool air, and every step brought back memories I had not visited in years. I remembered helping him stack hay, repairing old fence posts, and watching him carefully lock a weathered cedar chest before sliding it beneath a workbench. The building itself was gone, but I knew exactly where that corner had been. After clearing away several loose stones and patches of thick grass, I found what remained of the concrete floor. Near the edge, hidden beneath a rusted sheet of metal, was a narrow steel hatch almost completely buried by dirt. My heart began beating faster. The key fit the old lock on the very first try. The hinges groaned as I lifted the hatch, releasing the dry smell of aged wood and paper that had remained sealed for decades. Inside sat a cedar chest, remarkably preserved despite the passing years. I carefully brushed away the dust before opening the lid. Resting inside were neatly organized folders tied together with faded cotton string, several rolled survey maps protected inside cardboard tubes, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. I sat quietly for several minutes before opening it. His letter was simple. He wrote that land would always attract people who believe confidence could replace ownership, and that if I ever found myself questioning the truth, I should trust original records before trusting anyone's opinion. Beneath the letter rested the documents that changed everything. There was the original 1958 boundary survey bearing the county surveyor's embossed seal. Every monument, creek crossing, and property corner matched the stories my grandfather had spent years teaching me. Even more important was another folder labeled Ground Development Agreement, dated 1961. I had never heard him mention it. As I read through the pages, the reason became immediately clear. Decades earlier, my grandfather had signed a limited agreement allowing future utility access and certain development rights under carefully defined conditions. But the agreement explicitly stated that ownership of the underlying land would remain with him and his heirs unless a separate recorded purchase contract was executed. I searched every page twice. No purchase contract existed. No transfer of title appeared anywhere in the file. Attached to the agreement was a legal memorandum explaining that any permanent structure built outside the agreement could create continuing financial obligations for the occupying party if ownership remained unchanged. I slowly leaned back against the cedar chest while the morning breeze rustled through nearby oak trees. Suddenly, every strange detail from the county records made sense. The modern documents had repeatedly referred to development rights while quietly avoiding the original ownership language contained in these older records. They had built an impressive subdivision, secured financing, obtained permits, and convinced an entire community that the project rested on solid ground. Yet hidden beneath every foundation was a legal history almost nobody remembered because almost nobody knew where to look. I carefully returned every document to its folder, but this time I smiled. For the first time since arriving in Texas, I no longer felt like someone chasing answers. I finally held the missing piece everyone else had overlooked, and I realized I did not need to tear down a single house to prove who truly owned the ground beneath them. Once I understood what those forgotten documents actually meant, my entire strategy changed. I stopped thinking like someone preparing for a lawsuit and started thinking like the land surveyor my grandfather had trained me to become. Winning was never going to depend on the loudest argument. It would depend on building a chain of evidence so complete that every piece reinforced the next. Over the following week, I assembled a team that specialized in facts instead of drama. The first person I called was Rebecca Lawson, a veteran real estate attorney with a reputation for reading every footnote before every headline. The second was Martin Hayes, a forensic property surveyor whose measurements had settled some of the largest boundary disputes in Texas. The third was a certified property tax consultant who understood how development rights, land ownership, and long-term occupancy could intersect in ways most developers rarely expected. We met inside a modest conference room overlooking the courthouse square. There were no dramatic speeches, no promises of quick victories, and no emotional declarations. We simply spread every document across a long oak table and worked through them one page at a time. Rebecca compared the original agreements with the modern filings. Martin overlaid the historic surveys onto current satellite imagery using precise coordinate data. Every hour, another missing connection became visible. The subdivision had unquestionably been built where my family's land legally remained. More importantly, the original development agreement had never transferred ownership of the underlying property. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, folded her reading glasses, and smiled for the first time that morning. "You have something stronger than a claim," she said. "You have continuity." That single word stayed with me. Continuity. Every deed, every tax payment, every historical survey, every inherited record. Nothing had broken the legal chain connecting the land to my family. Meanwhile, the developer had built an entire luxury community on the assumption that nobody would ever reopen documents more than 60 years old. That assumption had become their greatest weakness. We deliberately chose not to request an emergency order stopping construction. At first, that decision surprised everyone, including me. Rebecca explained that interrupting the project immediately would only create unnecessary conflict while reducing leverage. Instead, we documented everything. Martin photographed every completed structure, every utility connection, every sidewalk, retaining wall, irrigation system, and entrance monument. Drone imagery established precise locations. Certified measurements confirmed the exact footprint of every improvement. The larger the completed development became, the more complete the evidentiary record grew. Every new day added another layer of documentation that could not easily be disputed later. Once our files were complete, Rebecca prepared a formal legal package unlike anything I had expected. There was no angry demand to demolish houses. No dramatic threat to seize property overnight. Instead, the documents calmly asserted my family's continuing ownership of the land, identified the relevant historical agreements, and requested negotiations regarding unauthorized long-term occupancy. Included with the notice was a detailed calculation of reasonable land lease value based upon current commercial standards together with a proposal for resolving the matter without disrupting homeowners who had purchased in good faith. As I signed the final page, I remembered standing outside those gates only days earlier while Victoria calmly informed me that I was trespassing. I wondered what expression would cross her face when she realized the conversation was no longer about removing me from the property. It was about explaining why an entire luxury subdivision had been standing on someone else's land all along. The response arrived 4 business days later in a thick overnight envelope delivered to Rebecca's office. I expected pages of denials, technical objections, and perhaps an invitation to negotiate. Instead, the first letter came from the developer's attorneys requesting an immediate meeting. The second arrived separately from the Homeowners Association's legal counsel, stating that the board had not been fully informed of several historical property issues before approving the subdivision. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. The united front I had seen at the entrance gates was beginning to fracture. Rebecca quietly smiled as she placed both letters side by side. "They are no longer defending the same story," she said. "Now they are defending themselves." A mediation session was scheduled the following week inside a conference center overlooking the county courthouse. There were no television cameras, no dramatic courtroom speeches, and no raised voices. Just polished oak tables, stacks of legal binders, and professionals who understood that carefully chosen words often carried more weight than loud arguments. Victoria Ashcroft entered with the same confident posture I remembered from the subdivision entrance, but this time she was accompanied by 2 attorneys and several members of the board. Carl Benson sat across the room with his own legal team, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The silence between them was impossible to ignore. Rebecca began by presenting the original survey, the 1961 development agreement, the uninterrupted chain of title, the tax history, and Martin's certified overlays showing the precise location of every completed structure. Each document connected naturally to the next until the entire timeline stretched across more than 6 decades without interruption. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned the authenticity of the records. They simply turned pages while taking notes. When the presentation ended, one attorney requested a short recess. Through the conference room windows, I watched the 2 legal teams separate into different corners of the hallway. Conversations became noticeably more animated. Fingers pointed toward binders. Phones appeared. Fresh copies were requested from assistants waiting outside. Nearly an hour passed before everyone returned. The atmosphere had completely changed. Carl Benson's attorney acknowledged that the development company had relied upon a title review that failed to reconcile the historic agreement with the modern subdivision filings. The Homeowners Association's counsel stated that the board had approved construction believing ownership questions had already been resolved before community governance officially began. Neither side wanted responsibility. Neither side wanted prolonged litigation. That was precisely why Rebecca had never demanded demolition. The families purchasing homes were not the problem, and we had no interest in disrupting their lives. Our proposal remained exactly as it had been from the beginning. The land would remain under my family's ownership. Existing homes would remain standing. Future occupancy would proceed through a long-term ground lease reflecting current market value together with appropriate compensation for prior unauthorized use. The room became remarkably quiet. Everyone understood the alternative could involve years of uncertainty affecting financing, insurance, future sales, and property values. Late that afternoon, the mediator summarized the emerging framework. Negotiations would continue based upon recognition of my family's continuing ownership interest and the financial obligations flowing from it. As we gathered our documents, Victoria finally looked directly at me. The certainty that had once filled her voice at the entrance gate had disappeared. She did not argue. She simply nodded once before leaving the room. For the first time since I had returned to Texas, nobody questioned whether I belonged there. The only question left was how much that forgotten piece of land was truly worth now that everyone finally understood who had owned it all along. 3 months later, I drove back through the same entrance where a security guard had once stopped me and a polished stone monument had quietly announced that I did not belong. The fountains still sparkled beneath the Texas sun. Children rode bicycles along clean sidewalks. Neighbors waved to one another while walking their dogs beneath young maple trees that had finally begun to grow into the landscape. From the outside, almost nothing had changed. That was exactly the outcome I had hoped for. Families who had purchased homes in good faith never lost them. The neighborhood continued to thrive. Construction finished on schedule, and new homeowners moved into the community without ever experiencing the uncertainty that had unfolded behind conference room doors and stacks of legal records. The difference existed beneath the surface, hidden inside carefully drafted agreements that would outlast every decorative entrance sign ever built. After weeks of negotiation, every party signed a comprehensive settlement recognizing my family's continuing ownership of the land beneath the development. A long-term ground lease was established using current market standards. Compensation was paid for the previous unauthorized occupancy, and future lease payments were scheduled through a professionally managed family land trust created in my grandfather's name. On the first business day of every month, a notification quietly appeared on my phone confirming another payment had been deposited. No headlines announced it. No television cameras covered it. Yet every transfer reminded me that patience, documentation, and truth had accomplished what anger never could. Rebecca later told me the settlement quickly became a case study discussed by several real estate attorneys because it demonstrated how forgotten historical agreements could still shape modern developments. Martin framed one of the restored survey maps inside his office, calling it his favorite reminder that the oldest records sometimes carried the greatest authority. Even Carl Benson eventually acknowledged that the development company had relied too heavily upon assumptions instead of fully reconstructing the property's legal history before breaking ground. Victoria changed as well. Months after everything concluded, I unexpectedly saw her during a community open house. She walked over without attorneys, folders, or carefully rehearsed confidence. She simply thanked me for choosing a solution that protected the homeowners while resolving the ownership dispute fairly. It was the shortest conversation we ever had, but somehow it was also the most honest. Before leaving, I drove one final time to the old oak tree beside the creek where my grandfather had spent so many mornings teaching me lessons I barely understood as a child. The cedar chest had already been transferred into secure archival storage, but I carried his original letter in the glove compartment of my truck. I read the final paragraph again before placing it back inside its envelope. He had written that land never rushed to defend itself because time usually revealed the truth better than emotion ever could. Standing there with a warm breeze moving across the pasture and sunlight reflecting from the rooftops in the distance, I finally understood exactly what he meant. People often ask whether I felt satisfied after everything that happened. The answer is simpler than they expect. I never wanted anyone to lose a home. I only wanted the truth to return to the place where it had always belonged. Justice does not always arrive with applause or dramatic victories. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on the first business day of every month, through a simple notification confirming that promises made generations ago are still being honored today. And every time I hear that familiar alert, I smile because my grandfather was right. The land remembered everything.